Greetings, lovers of lore! Thank you for joining me for the second installment of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan story. This part of the story starts with Wada, Huatli, and Quintorius, as well as a contingent of Imperial soldiers led by Inti and Captarocti. Wada was anxious and eager. The Phyrexian invasion she had been a part of had made life simple in a number of ways for her. She just had to follow orders and do what she was told. When the invasion ended, Wada was left with a missing eye and no purpose. Aimless, she had taken up with the pirates of the Brazen Coalition. Her time spent at sea helped her forget the pain of everyone she had lost. So she returned to the Sun Empire to serve as a warrior, so she could find herself in exactly these type of situations. As they traveled deeper into Ixalan, they encountered more signs of fighting and more glowing pink-purple pigment. Quintorius confirmed with Huatli that she had never seen it before now. Quintorius' methods of investigation were off-putting to Captarocti. He had picked up something that looked like pottery with his trunk and touched it to his tongue, declaring that it was bone. Further along, down some dark tunnel, they encountered the bodies of more fallen warriors before running into a giant chasm full of green fog that glowed ominously. Huge stone blocks floated above the chasm. There were big gaps between the stones that made the prospect of crossing them quite daunting. After inspecting the area, the group came to the conclusion that particular stones had to be jumped on based on the symbols on the side of the chasm. Wada volunteered to make the attempt, and things went well at first until she accidentally stumbled after one of her jumps and fell on the wrong stone. It plummeted from the air with her on it. She barely managed to leap and grab the edge of the correct stone, but the stone started to shift around, and Wada was only saved from falling by the quick intervention of Captarocti. There were glyphs on the wall, and part of the translation contained a poem that explained the glyphs. Wada pressed the glyphs in the right order, and the stones formed into a bridge that everyone could cross. The story then switches to Malcolm. He's in the miners' camp. He was having a terrible time. Sirens don't do well in cramped, confined spaces. There's no room for their wings to stretch out, and he had gone down so many elevator shafts. Every level they went to, they found tracks showing that all the people who were here had moved en masse ever downwards. It wasn't until they had taken a dozen elevators that anything changed. The air here smelled like mold and rot, and tools were scattered down one tunnel. Malcolm took some of his men and headed down that way. The walls were lined with ever-thickening fungus that glowed the further they got in. The tunnel led to a cavern, and in that cavern, Malcolm found a nightmare. A dead but not dead raptor, rotted and with fungal appendages dangling from its mushroom-covered hide. Spores erupted from the raptor's neck, and Malcolm yelled for his men to cover their mouths and wrapped his bandana around his face. The raptor attacked one of the pirates, who was actually able to keep it at bay. But things rapidly got worse as more raptors started to appear. Their fungal strands were moving them in an unnerving unison. Malcolm grabbed breeches and bolted. The story then switches over to Vito. He's feeling triumphant, looking at a mosaic of Alcazotz, the bat god of the vampires. But Vito has concerns about Bartolome. Bartolome has influence as the director of the Queen's Bay Company, and he would cling to the old ways and ultimately was just here seeking treasure for the Queen. And what of Amalia? Sometimes Vito saw her staring blankly, speaking wordlessly. Was she hearing Alcazot's as well? Vito put the thought aside. He was the chosen of the Bat God. His musings were interrupted by news of them finding another golden door, again with another altar. Another sacrifice was made, and the door opened in response to the blood offering. Vito expected to find more tunnels, but to his surprise was met with a strange desert. Light came in from holes in the ceiling. A scout was sent to look for signs of Alcazot's. He took 6 steps out into the desert and was immediately swallowed up by the sand. Even quicksand doesn't engulf men so quickly. The troops were rattled, but Vito was undeterred. So he sent his right-hand man, Clavellino, who had the ability to turn into smoke and fly. Clavellino flew around, checking for stable places out in the sands. The vampire troops laid wooden boards across the sands between the safe spots, but they had to reuse the wood from point to point, which slowed them considerably as the troops in the back had to keep handing the wood all the way up to the front. Things got worse when a half-dozen mantis spiders skittered across the sands. They darted out, grabbing 2 men and tearing them apart and eating the chunks. The horses went crazy and tried to bolt. Vito shouted for his men to kill the mantis spiders. Some vampires leapt into the air, while Amalia used magic to paralyze one. Bartolome then used his magical whip to tear its head off. It didn't take long to finish off the mantis spiders. They made it across the desert to a pathway marked by bat wings. They had lost a handful of people. Vito said their sacrifice was not in vain. Bartolome looked troubled for a moment, but Vito was ultimately unconcerned. The story then returns to Quintorius, who is having an amazing time exploring the ruins of an underground city. The city's stones were covered with glowing blue and green fungus that grew in mathematical patches. In the center of the city, Quint found a garment that glowed purple and pink, and using his magic, he animated the spirit of the garment's owner. It was a confused old grandfather who yelled about the mycoid infestation and ran off saying, "The door must be closed." Quintorius sprinted after the ghost. He wanted answers. The story then returns to Malcolm, who is fighting the fungal dinosaurs. These things didn't feel pain, which was unfortunate because their mushroom-covered bodies were easy to cut. He had to try something else. He started to sing. Everyone but Malcolm was transfixed, spellbound by his siren song. He systematically butchered the dinosaurs, singing the entire time. Covered in grisly remains, he threw up in the corner. The pirates were banged up, but otherwise intact. Malcolm was relieved nobody had died. They regrouped, and Malcolm noticed that the wounded pirates had changed. Black scabs had somehow already formed on their wounds, and they spoke almost in unison. Malcolm had grave doubts, but pushed onwards. The story then turns to Amalia. She had continued to map out the underground. Up ahead, the map showed some kind of fire. Was this connected to her visions? The source of fire turned out to be lava cascading down a wall, surrounded by buildings. Amalia saw a young man come dashing out of a building with 2 blades of light. He was being chased by half a dozen goblins. The young man yelled for help while cutting a goblin spear from the air. Amalia moved to help, but Bartolome held her back. Vito had no intention of getting involved. He kept his forces moving, but Amalia couldn't leave him to his fate. She pulled out her map and enchanted quill. She'd have to be very careful, or she might kill him instead of save him. She scratched a little line onto the map while muttering an incantation, and behind the young man, a gap opened up under the goblins, and they fell to their death. But she barely missed dropping the young man. He fell clinging to the edge. He managed to hang on, pulled himself up, and came jogging over. Bartolome congratulated Amalia on saving him, but Vito's eyes were dark with annoyance. The young man introduced himself as Kellen and went to say more, but Vito cut him off. Our holy quest allows for no distractions. Vito wanted nothing to do with Kellen, but Amalia offered to be responsible for Kellen, and Vito relented and allowed it. At that point, Bartolome leaned in and warned Amalia to never openly defy Vito again. She thanked him for the advice. The smell of Kellen's blood was enticing, so she distracted herself by asking if he needed his wounds bound. Kellen said he could do it himself, but he did ask if she could tell him who they were. Amalia wasn't sure what to tell him that wouldn't put both of their lives in grave danger. All right, my friends, that ends this installment of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan story. I hope that you enjoyed it. We'll have another one for you tomorrow, so come on by again. If you enjoy what we're doing here, you can support the channel by joining the channel membership or our Patreon. Big shout out to the channel's members and patrons. Thank you very much for supporting what we're doing here. I will see you all for the next video. Go enjoy some more lore on this channel because remember, my friends, lore is life.